Hello and welcome into TYT's A Conversation. It is your host, Adrienne Lawrence. Today I have joining me Varun Nikore. Yes, that's the AAPI Victory Alliance Executive Director. Thanks so much for joining us, Varun.
Good to be with you again, Adrienne.
All right, so we are a little under a week out from the midterm elections, and I know that polling among Asian Americans in battleground states is a big issue right now, particularly because of new reports showing that there is a significant non-economic issue for the AAPI community. What is that exactly?
Yeah, so we polled over 2,000 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in battleground states in late summer. And really significant is the fact that gun violence is the top non-economic issue amongst those polled. And this was, frankly, something that existed between the five major sub-ethnicities within the API community. And so it's really significant. For the first time ever, it's showed up that prominently in a survey.
Wow. And why would you say that that has now become a leading factor, and that's particularly the case that it's so bothersome right now?
Well, no doubt, shortly before the survey, we had the horrible massacre in Uvalde, Texas. I'm in Texas through the end of the election, and I've been here since late summer. And I can tell you sort of what I'm seeing on the ground amongst the API community is the overwhelming concern, not only of guns, particularly of guns, but just the fact that we've had so many school shootings lately. But also, this survey came along the heels of what happened in the supermarket in Buffalo as well, in a largely predominantly Black neighborhood, and mostly Blacks were, murdered. And so I think these things that have been happening much more commonplace lately. It's something that I think for the first time, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have said, enough is enough here. And, for decades, frankly, we've had folks from the right tell us it's all about the Second Amendment, right? We need to have these guns to protect ourselves, to hunt, et cetera. But unfettered access to guns is now reached, I would say, a breaking point. If you can continue to layer on the many breaking points that we've had over many decades, but I think many APIs have finally said it. Enough is enough, and they're, I think, really in this election going to take that into account when they go into the polling booth and when they fill out those early ballots and absentee ballots, and they're going to hold politicians accountable.
That is good, because we definitely need to see some meaningful change out there. Whatever the issue is that necessarily is the impetus for it, I think all of us, in terms of progressives, are looking forward to there being some kind of meaningful change in terms of our leadership. And so also in this research that you did in terms of taking the temperature, getting the pulse of what is a very meaningful issue to AAPI voters, what else did you find?
Well, obviously, the economy, jobs, inflation, that resonates amongst the API community and across all communities, all Americans right now. That is consistently showing up as the top issues. And obviously, those are all in the economic bucket. So what's really interesting is, despite the fact that we've got very low employment and the fact that, Americans have essentially gotten richer during the pandemic, for the most part, right? We are still seeing concerns about high gas prices and inflation. That being said, America has the lowest inflation rate than any modern economy, and so I'm not sure folks really take that into account when they've got to live paycheck to paycheck like many Americans are. But at the end of the day, right, it's essentially Putin's gas tax by, essentially invading his neighbor in Ukraine and causing gas prices to spike up all around the world. It's the central driver to all this. And I think President Biden has done as good of a job, frankly, than any president could do. And yet I think has even achieved more in his administration, passing the Inflation Reduction Act and ensuring that, we do whatever we can to bring down costs for everyday Americans.
Yes, and also when we talk about everyday Americans, particularly that impacting the AAPI community and concerns when it comes to going into, dropping the vote in the ballot box. In terms of the battleground states, what else are you seeing in terms of things that really are striking people?
Well, it's interesting. So I'm an avid poll watcher, perhaps to my detriment. It keeps me up late at night. But I can tell you this, that honestly, looking at the numbers, not much has shifted these last several weeks as we enter the final week before Election Day. And so the polls that frankly were in place several weeks ago, and the numbers, they've really stayed the same, strikingly. And so the generic ballot, how do you feel about electing a Democrat versus a Republican? That stayed very constant. It's plus or minus, I would say 1.5 points to either side. So really no shifts there. What that means effectively is that today, if the election were held, that we would end up almost close to net even. So if obviously the Democrats have a very loose and simple majority right now, they would maintain that majority. And so what we are seeing today is, frankly, not holistic change in a lot of the polls. There is a concern that there's been a lot of junk polls coming out of the right. And what that means essentially is polls coming out from very low-ranked pollsters. The website 538.com ranks pollsters by how good they are, how transparent they are with their methodologies. And so the last 2 weeks, we're seeing more and more polls essentially flood the zone. So really low-ranked pollsters that are aligned with candidates on the right who are pushing out polls that have got very sketchy methodologies and are essentially trying to game the system. And by that, I mean 538, realclear.politics.com. They take an average of all the polls and they say, this is what we're seeing in terms of the net movement on the left and the right. And the national narrative, because I think a lot of media is picking up on this, but the national narrative is, the Republicans are surging towards the end. But when you really look at all the methodologies of the polls and the actual polls themselves, we've really seen very little movement these last several weeks, which frankly bodes very well for Democrats, frankly, because we were not really supposed to win much. We were in this election, we were supposed to lose the House, we were supposed to lose seats in the Senate, and we're not really seeing that. So at the end of the day, even if the Democrats lose a few seats, we may lose the House, certainly. It was always expected to do so anyway.
And so with these kind of shaky polls that are out there, is the kind of the goal out there to sway people who are Democrats so they don't necessarily even bother voting? Is that what they're gaming for?
Exactly. Yes, exactly, Adrienne. And so they're gaming the system, and these averages, which are touted on every national news network, journalists right now are obviously in this competition to write the latest narrative, right? And so when they see these polling averages trend in one direction or another, they jump on it. And it's this bandwagon effect. And so everyone is writing stories about how Democrats are in decline and Republicans are surging. And it is very much serving as almost a psychological warfare amongst all the polls, because candidates and I would say political entities know that a lot of folks are watching what's going on in this very important election, and they're trying to game the system. But we're fighting back these last 7-8 days before the election, getting folks to see, look, honestly, you shouldn't be looking at polls anyway if you're a voter and you're not really in the business, because if you're not in the business, you don't understand how these things can be gamed. At the end of the day, every American, whether you're on the left or the right or in the middle, you just need to get out and vote, because that's the only thing that can change our system, and not watching the polls.
Absolutely. Yes, for various reasons, we find that polls may not necessarily be as reliable or as predictable as we had originally forecasted. So getting out there and voting is so incredibly important. And so I echo that sentiment that people should be going out, voting or getting in their votes by mail. Whatever needs to be done, get it done. Yes, please. All right, so in terms of the short amount of time that we now have between now and the midterm elections, what is something that you think people definitely need to keep their eye on, or maybe it's a particular jurisdiction?
I think on one level, right, we've got battles in the Senate. I think we're hearing about that every single day. The very pivotal Senate race in Pennsylvania between John Fetterman, the current lieutenant governor, and the TV personality, Dr. Oz, right? So that's going to be one pivotal race to watch because the Democrats currently don't hold that seat. It was Pat Toomey, who is not Senator Pat Toomey, who's decided not to run for re-election. That's causing this open seat in Pennsylvania. So that could be very pivotal. If on the East Coast, as the polls close, we see that Fetterman is leading and even wins this election, it is likely going to be a good night for Democrats. That's one leading indicator. Another leading indicator could be what happens in the Senate race in North Carolina between Republican Ted Budd and Democrat Sherry Beasley, who is a sitting Supreme Court justice in that state. And so if the Democrats end up having a good night in Pennsylvania, if the Senate race is really close, or actually even goes towards Senator Beasley, Senator-elect Beasley, then it's going to be, I think, almost a resounding sweep across the nation. Now, if they remain, if both of those races remain tight, it's going to be a little bit of a longer night for all of us.
All right, then. Well, I think it's something we're all going to have to keep our eye out watching. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Varun Nikore, AAPI Victory Alliance Executive Director.